Morning. Oh, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No rush yet, no bother. want to? Yeah. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I have your attention, please? Um, Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year! Happy New Year to you all. You're all very welcome to Tipperary Museum's lecture series, The Big House. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker this morning, John Flannery. John is no stranger to any of you who have been with us at previous lecture series and exhibitions in the museum. John is based in Nina. He's a local historian and he's a prolific researcher in the area of not just the Big House but also Tipperary in the decade of revolution, and some of you may have come across him in that guise previously or here with us in our various lectures in the past. So there's nothing else for me to say, only to hand you over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for turning out this morning on such a miserable day for a history lecture this early in the morning. Men we're going to talk about this morning, William Leeson. We've no information on where or when he was born. None of the houses he resided in have survived. We don't know when or where he died. We don't know where he's buried. And no likeness, portrait or anything indicating what he looked like has ever been identified. So you may say, what the hell are we doing here this morning? There's not much to know about this man. But hopefully as the morning progresses, we might identify a bit about him and find out a little more about who he was and what he was actually about. We know that William Leeson won a competition for the layout of the new town of Westport in 1767. This competition was actually sponsored by John Brown, who had been born around 1709, and he was the Earl of Altamont in 1771. Now, Brown had commissioned Richard Cassels to construct Westport House around 1730. And an advertisement was published in the Faulkner's Journal, or Faulkner's Dublin Journal, on the 17th of March, 1767. And that advertisement read, and I quote, "To all bricklayers, masons, stonecutters, carpenters, joiners, sawyers, slaters, plasterers, glaziers, painters, and all other artificers in the building branch, and to the public in general, this is to inform them that a new town is immediately to be built near the old town of Westport in the county of Mayo, according to plans and elevations, etc., already fixed upon, consisting of a large and elegant market house, situated in the centre of an octagon, area of 200 feet, and to be enclosed with 12 large, well-finished, slated houses, together with 3 avenues for streets of 30 slated houses, and several very large streets for a great number of thatched houses and cabins, to be built separately in such streets where houses or cabins are to be admitted, at an expense from about 20 to 40 guineas for each house or cabin, together with several convenient plots for cabins of all inferior kind. All workmen who are willing to contract for any of the said employments are desired to send their proposals, particularly identifying every article of their various branches in writing, sealed to the Honourable Peter Brown Kelly at Westport Castlebar, or William Leeson, Esquire, Architect, any time before the 6th of April next, when their proposals will be examined, and no preference will be given to any tradesman. It is expected all persons to whom it may be convenient will apply, as such only will be closed with as are workmen and willing to engage upon the cheapest terms, and that can give sufficient security for the performance of their covenant. All persons who choose to take a plot of ground to build upon, according to the plans and regulations for each street, will meet with suitable encouragement. Westport is situated near the sea coast, a remarkable, healthy and plentiful county, with convenience of every fine and large lot of improved ground with plenty of fire and water and several convenient plots for bleach, greens, mills, etc. The plans and elevations are to be seen at Westport. So quite a large ad, and we can presume that it attracted quite a large response. Now, we know that William Leeson purchased a timber yard and a timber importing business in Limerick in 1772. We also know that he was a freeholder living at Bolingbroke, Dala in North Tipperary in 1776. And in October 1785, his house at Bolingbroke was robbed. Now, he's been described as an architect, a horticulturalist, an antiquary, and a magistrate. He owned extensive property in England, and his last will and testament was proven in 1786. Now, Leeson is described in the Dictionary of Irish Biography as an amateur architect. However, for an amateur architect, he actually managed to attract commissions from a lot of nobility, people of, we'll say, high and prolific means, and he was very, very popular as an architect. If we look at the town of Westport, we have here Westport House, and here you have the location of the old village or town of Westport, Caherna-Mart. And with the improvements that Brown decided to embark upon in Westport, he decided that he had to remove this town, Caherna-Mart. It was in the way of his improvements. Namely, it was occupying what he proposed as his front lawn. So it had to be moved. So he came up with this idea of the competition, and so Leeson was the winner of the competition. And this is the town that he actually laid out, all based around this octagon here at the centre. Here you actually see a picture from the 1800s of the very same octagon, and in the background, just here, you have the market house. Here we see a more recent photograph of the market house, which is still extant. The market house we know was built around 1767, and it's attributed to Leeson. Now, looking at Tipperary, there are 4 known works attributed to Leeson, constructed between 1768 and 1785. Those were, would say, described at the time of their building and subsequently as being the work of William Leeson, architect. However, through correspondence located in some North Tipperary families, we've also identified a further 2 houses from earlier period, which can also be attributed to Leeson. So I propose to deal with the 4 later houses first, and then we'll have a word about the earlier properties. As I said earlier, Leeson was residing at the time at Bolingbroke in Dala. Now, let's locate all of this. We're talking about the northern half of Tipperary here, as you see here. And if we zoom in on that, we'll say taking as our locating point, Lochderg. Bolingbroke is down here south of Lake, up in the foothills of the Schlieffelham Hills. Kilboy House, which we'll be talking about, was located in the village of Dala. Very close by is Traverstown House. Johnstown House, another building which was constructed here close to Lochderg. And the only Tipperary house by Leeson still in existence, if you like, the gem in the crown, is Prior Park. Again, located close enough to the lake, just on the outskirts of the village of Kearney. Now, the other 2 properties are Lisson Hall and Castle Ottawa, which were both belonged to the Ottawa family. Now, let's deal first with Kilboy. Kilboy was built between the years 1768 and 1771. The client was Baron or Lord Denali, one of the largest landowners in Tipperary. The house was actually constructed in a Baroque style, laid out in very formal grounds. Here you can see the landscape as designed by Leeson. You had the house and the outbuildings here. You had an ornamental lake constructed just to the southeast of the house, and you had an extensive walled garden just at the back here. So the client was Henry Pretty, later first Baron Denali, and the house was constructed in the Baroque style. It was 3 stories over a basement and consisted of 5 bays, all constructed on a raised plinth. Now, the original house was completed around 1768. This house, unfortunately, was burnt on the night of the 2nd of 3rd of August, 1922, during the Civil War. Raiders appeared at the house at around 2 a.m. and they instructed the land agent, who was residing in the house at the time as a caretaker, and the other domestic staff in the house to leave the premises. They proceeded to smash the windows to create a draft in the house and liberally sprinkled petrol from the top story right down through the house and set it alight. It burned right through the night and for most of the following day, and it was late in the evening the following day before the fire eventually more or less burned itself out. One of the great losses in Kilby House was the library. There was over 6,000 volumes in the library, dating back to the very early stages of the Denali family, we'll say, in Ireland, which was in the Cromwellian period. A lot of records of County Tipperary were actually destroyed in that fire. Now, in keeping with the compensation claims at the time, Denali had actually to give a declaration that he would rebuild in order to receive compensation. So he did rebuild the house, but it was entirely on a lesser scale, if you like. The top story was missing off the house. The house itself was way smaller. There was no grand staircase as constructed in the original building. Instead, there was a timber staircase leading to a gallery, and where a lot of the original house had been panelled in marble and other precious stone, the walls in the new house were clad in timber. Now, that house was demolished in 1952 and was replaced with a bungalow. And we'll actually see these various stages of construction on the site. That bungalow was rebuilt in the 1980s by Tony Ryan of, we'll say, Ryanair, Guinness Peak Aviation fame, and again by his son Shane Ryan in 2010, when a house based actually on Leeson's plans, but a modern iteration of that was actually constructed there. So the building was finished in 2010, and Country Life magazine described it as the finest house built in Europe in the last 100 years. Now, during the destruction of the house in 1952, the actual basement designed by Leeson was actually filled with rubble. And so a bungalow was built on the plinth, which was remodeled and extended by Tony Ryan with the help of Lady Miranda Guinness, who he was associated with at the time. And she was very much, we'll say, into Georgian architecture, so pretty much a lot of the Guinness family were. This house was demolished and replaced by Quinlan and Francis Terry, who built the mansion for Shane Ryan in a classical style. Here you can see one of the original entrance gates, and as we work through, you'll notice that this is fairly typical of Leeson's work. You tended to get these pedimented gateways with 2 smaller gateways either side of them. Here you see the house which replaced the original. This was the one built between 1927 and 1929. It's only a shadow of what the previous house looked like. And here you see the ignominy of all ignominies, the bungalow that was built to replace it's still utilising the former plinth of the old mansion. Kilby, would say in its original form, consisted of a 5-bay house with the pediments overhead the windows, alternating between triangular pediments and segmented arched pediments in the Venetian style. The house was supposed to have been based actually on a house designed by Inigo Jones in Greenwich for Charles II. Now, the house itself was 84 feet on each side, and over 70 feet high. You had 4 engaged Doric columns across the front of the house. Engaged columns meant that they were actually attached to the front wall of the building as opposed to freestanding. And you had 2 pilaster columns at either end of the frontage. And these supported a large triangular portico in the Doric style, and there was a Doric pediment extending the full length of the facade of the building, above which there was a full-height attic. Now, full-height attics weren't typical of Baroque or classical buildings at the time. They tended to be an Irish feature, found in quite a number of Irish houses of the time, but strangely enough, not found in England. Here you see another picture of the bungalow, we'll say, following Tony Ryan's renovations to it. He added this pediment here, supported by a few freestanding columns. And here you see a side view of the house. This was a new wing built on by Ryan, actually, to house his art collection. Now, here you can see a picture of the house designed by Quinlan and Francis Terry, which, I say, based on Leeson's design, and is the current, we'll say, building that occupies the site. You can actually see some of the features here which I described. You can see the Doric pediment, we'll say, and the entablature extending along the full side of the building. You have the alternating pediments on the windows here, segmented and triangular, and you have the 4 Doric columns and the pilasters at either end. And up here in the centre of the pediment, you had a œil de boeuf, or a bullseye window, which was located just here in the centre of the pediment. Now, the basement which Leeson had designed and which had been filled in at the time of the bungalow, this is actually a photograph of it. When Shane Ryan reconstructed the modern version of the house, he had the original basement cleared out and fully restored, and this is what it actually looks like with the arched and vaulted ceilings. It gives an idea of the scale of the building, and we'll say the expense that was lavished on the construction of the house. Now, very close to Kilby, you have Traverstown House, which was built around 1785. And Traverstown, it's again, it's a 6-bay building with a slightly protruding central bay above a Doric portico at the front door. It's not quite as grand as Kilby, but again, it's a very good example of houses at the time. And again, if we look at the landscape which Leeson laid out, this time to the north of the house he constructed an ornamental lake, and you had kind of this grand vista planted with trees, and that extending out from, let's say, the north side of the house. You had the outbuildings here south of it, and you had a walled garden just to the east. It was 3 stories over basement, say in 6 bays, with two central bays stepped out. In other words, they protruded slightly from the front wall. And the house was distinguished by raised quoins, which were of dressed limestone. Now, the client for Traverstown was a man by the name of Caleb Going. Unlike Kilby, there was no raised plinth. And again, he used a portico with 4 Doric columns. Now, the roof of Traverstown was removed in the early 1930s, in keeping with a lot of what was happening at the time. A lot of these families, lands had been, we'll say, handed over to the Land Commission, farms had been broken up, and the remaining holdings weren't attracting the rental roll that, we'll say, had supported these houses in previous years. So the money just simply wasn't there to maintain those houses. And at the time, rates were, we'll say, in terms of cost of living, rates were extremely high. So there was a policy at the time for a lot of these families that weren't able to maintain these houses. They very often moved into the outbuildings of the house, we'll say converted stables and outbuildings into living accommodation, moved from the big houses into those buildings and removed the roof from the house and let nature take its course. And that's what happened in the case of Traverstown. Gradually the building just succumbed to nature with the roof removed, the ceilings fell in, the house deteriorated, and eventually it was demolished in 1958. Now, the last resident of the house was Miss Annie Harriet Norris, and some of you may prick at the name Norris, and yes, you're right, related to Senator David Norris, former presidential candidate. Norris actually describes in an interview with Joe Duffy, which he did on Liveline several years ago, spending his childhood, we'll say, travelling to Nina from Dublin by steam train and spending a lot of his childhood with Harriet Norris in Traverstown. So she was the last resident there. Unfortunately, today there's not a single vestige of the house. You won't find any remains of the lake, not even the wharf walls existing. The basement, everything has vanished. The basement's been filled in. The house has literally been obliterated from the landscape totally. We're left with, we'll say, the photographs of the ruin really to give us an idea of what it was like. This is probably one of the last photographs of Traverstown, taken in 1952, showing it in a rather sorry state. Now, another house by Leeson was Johnstown House. Johnstown appears to have been constructed between the years 1768 and 1777. The reason for the ambiguity about its construction, an estate map of the Johnstown estate in 1768 actually shows the house in existence. Now, this may have been because it was actually under construction, but Arthur Young, the horticulturalist that made 3 trips around Ireland, in the account of his 1777 trip, he described visiting Johnstown, where Peter Holmes, the proprietor, had made extensive improvements in terms of farming, and Arthur Young actually stayed at Johnstown in what he described as Mr. Holmes's newly constructed house. So, okay, the house wouldn't have been built, we'll say, in a year or probably even 2 years. Construction may have been dragged out over a period of time as money was available, but it would appear that, from Young's account anyway, that Peter Holmes was not long resident in Johnstown when he stayed there in 1777. You can see the house here in the photograph. It's rather plain other than the ornamental heads over the front door and the fanlight here. It was pretty much a plain stucco finish with raised stone quoins on the corners. it extended over 5 bays on each side. Again, kind of a hallmark of Leeson's work, in that a lot of his buildings tended to be very square. They were as broad as they were wide, we'll say. Again, if we look at the landscape, in this instance, he didn't have to construct a lake. There was actually a natural lake in the vicinity, Powell Lake, and he actually constructed a house so that it was facing towards the lake and looking down, would say, more or less the length of the lake to the south. Again, here we see an entrance gate typical of Leeson's work. The large arched central gate with the 2 small wicket gates either side of it. This is the only remains of Johnstown House that actually exists, is the gate here at Johnstown. The house itself has been demolished. It was commissioned by Peter Holmes. I said construction between 1768 and 1777 consisted of 5 bays in 3 stories over a basement, raised quines with a stucco finish. It was purchased by the Irish Land Commission in 1936. The roof was removed in 1941, and during the 1980s the walls were tumbled. The basement was filled in, and the plinth on which the house was actually constructed is a silage slab today. That's the only remains, we'll say, that we have of the house, apart from the fact that a beautiful Carrera marble fireplace, which was in one of the entrance rooms in Johnstown, currently exists in a nearby house, Killadiernan Rectory. If you go on to daft.ie at the moment, Killadiernan Rectory is actually for sale, and there's a video which takes you, we'll say, on a tour through the house, and in one of the sitting rooms you'll actually see the large white Carrera marble fireplace. Seemingly there was a pair of fireplaces in the 2 entrance, we'll say 2 reception rooms in the house. On the left hand side, in the main reception room, you had this white Carrera marble fireplace, and in the room on the right there was a black Kilkenny limestone fireplace. What happened to the black Kilkenny limestone fireplace, we don't know, but at the time of the demolition of the house, it was purchased by the owners of the white Carrera one was purchased by the owners of Killadiernan Rectory. Now that brings us to Prior Park. Prior Park, Prior Park is probably the house we know most about. We know the very day the construction of the house started in 1779, and we know that we'll say the man that commissioned the house moved into the house in 1785. The reason we know so much about Prior Park, a lady by the name of Elizabeth Freeman, who lived at Ballinware, Nina, she kept a diary for the years 1777 to 1786, and she actually mentioned in her diary that James Otway constructed the building of his house in 1779. Now, again, if we look at the location of Prior Park, again, Leeson made use of a local lake, Clary Loch, as the ornamental lake for the house. He laid out Prior Park and its outbuildings just here, looking west towards Clary Loch, and the village of Kearney, which would have been a property of the Otways at the time, is just here to the east of the house. Again, we'll say extensive parkland all around the house. The client said was James Otway, and building commenced on the 20th of April 1779, according to Elizabeth Freeman's diary. And James, again, according to Elizabeth Freeman, James Otway moved into the house in 1785. Now, Otway was one of the, we'll say, the Otway families of Tipperary. They owned extensive lands in North Tipperary. Cromwellian family settled in what would have been, we'll say, Cloconan at Tipperary, which subsequently was named Castle Ottaway by the Ottaway family. They built a large mansion attached to a Kennedy Tower house in Tipperary, and they lived there from, I say, the Cromwellian times right up till the 1920s. One of them was involved in the, suppressing 1798 rebellion and was noted for his cruelty. At one stage, he'd whipped two men from the Turnpike of Nina to the Market Cross of Nina. In other words, they were horsewhipped full distance from the Turnpike Gate of Nina to the Market Cross in the centre of the town, a distance of 1 mile. And we'll say that event is actually recorded in history of the time. Ottaway himself is actually buried in Tipperary churchyard, and in the crypt of Tipperary Church there are extensive Ottaway remains there. One of the last members of the family with Tipperary connections was Ottaway Ruthven. She was professor of history in Trinity College Dublin, and she's actually buried in the crypt of Tipperary Church. But we'll say James Ottaway would have been from that family, not directly from Tipperary himself, would have come to Prior Park by way of Leeson Hall. Now, he was forced actually to sell the house in 1808, due to what was said to be his prolific lifestyle. Seemingly he was noted for holding extensive parties, and he was also quite a noted gambler. So he hit hard times in 1808 and was forced to sell the house. Prior Park is very similar to Johnstown House in that it was constructed of 5 bays on the front elevation, however slightly smaller in that the side elevation, and this being a departure for Leeson, consisted only of 3 bays. Excuse me. There's little or no ornamentation. There was no raised quoins, and it's finished in a plain stucco finish. Now, it was purchased by George Waller in 1808, and a son of George Waller's was Robert Waller, who married Eliza Guinness of the Guinness family. And he was the founder of the Waller malting business. You may have heard of Wallers as being extensive maltsters, and they went into that business, we'll say, due to their connections with the Guinness family. And we'll say the Waller malting business was quite extensive up around the Midlands, right up to Port Arlington. And for years they were more or less, we'll say, the only suppliers of malt to the Guinness brewery. In 1986, the last of the Wallers actually sold Prior Park, and that was a lady by the name of Sally Waller, and I think there's tremendous credit due to Sally Waller, as we'll see as we go along. Here you see a watercolour of Prior Park, done by a member of the Waller family in 1871. It shows the house, and you can see the parkland surrounding the house at the time. It's quite a nice view of the building. Here we see Prior Park in 1957, at the time when Sally Waller was attempting to keep the building intact and to live there. And if you look carefully, you'll see the state of the house. I mean, you can see broken windows up here in the top story. There's a huge section of the roof here where the guttering has collapsed, and a lot of slates are actually missing from the building. So you can only imagine what life must have been like for Sally Waller living there at the time. Both her parents would have been alive, we'd say, at that stage. Both would have been extremely elderly. Here we see an interior shot of the house, and this would have been shortly before it was sold in 1986, but you can actually see the dampness here marking the walls of the house. That's actually the entrance hall in Prior Park, and that wall would have been one of the main, we'll say, rising walls going right up through the house, which will contain the fireplaces up along. And you can see the way, we'll say, that it allowed the dampness to penetrate right down through the chimneys. And the wall here in the hallway is extensively marked. Now, here we see another photograph of the hallway. Again, you can see the dampness here, and you have a lot of the portraits of the members of the Waller family. Here you have the dining room, as existed, we'll say, during Sally's tenure there. Small dining table, a lot of the furniture crammed into the room. Here you can actually see we'll say, one of the downstairs windows, which are quite significant in that the lower portion of the windows only had 2 panes of glass. They didn't have Georgian glazing, we'll say, right through the full window. The upper portion is glazed in the Georgian style, but you had these 2 large panes of glass in the lower portion of the window, and that was to actually allow a better vista of we'll say, the parkland around the house. I don't know whether you're aware, but one of the reasons why Georgian houses tended to actually have small panes of glass was due to the actual difficulty of constructing large, blemish-free sheets of glass at the time. So in order to get glass without any blemishes and bullseye finishes in anything like that, they tended to be quite small sheets of glass. Now, by the time the construction of Park, the glassmaking techniques had actually improved, and they were able to, we'll say, make slightly larger sheets of glass, and hence Leeson made use of these larger panes of glass in the lower portions of the ground floor windows, and that, as I said, to facilitate a better vista of the parkland, really. Again, you have a photograph of Prior Park, and you'll notice in this typical, say, 1970s, 1980s beauty board used here to try and form a draft screen from the doorway behind it. All the seating is quite close to the fireplace. There was no central heating in the house, so it was dependent purely on fireplaces. And in an effort to try and maintain an existence, Sally had actually, would say, making use of draft screens, things like that, to try and keep warmth in the house and try and make it bearable to actually live there. She was desperately trying to hold on to the property. I mean, she saw it kind of as her family duty, that she was the last surviving member of the family, direct member of that family, and that she had the duty to preserve the property and try and pass it on in maintaining its existence. That wasn't going to follow like a lot of the other big houses, the roof removed, just purchased only for sake of the farmland, and eventually just succumbed to the ravages of time. Again, another photograph of the interior, and again you can see here the large panes of glass in the window here, and slightly clearer photograph again of the drawing room here. Again, the fireplace here, the furniture placed very close to the fire. Another photograph of the drawing room. Again, you can see the proximity of the furniture to the fireplace, and a lot of the portraits, the family portraits that were in the house at the time. Now, if we look at some of the similarities, here you actually have the photograph of Leeson's market house in Westport, and if we look at the pediment, it's unusual in the would say the steepness of the side, we'll say, of the pediment. Normally, a pediment on a building like this could be spread out, we'll say, further towards the sides, and you'd have more gradually sloping. But here we have Castle Otway, which we know now is one of Leeson's first houses. And again, you can see a very similar pediment, very steeply sloping pediment, overhead 3 windows, as in the Market House. So again, you see the similarities of Leeson's work. And here we have one of the finest houses that he built after Kilby. It was Leeson Hall. Unfortunately, again, reduced to a ruin today. Here we can see a pretty poor photograph of Castle Otway. You can just about make out the Tower House, which was the original O'Kennedy Tower House, and which the Otway family had lived in prior to the construction of Castle Otway. Again, a square construction, five bays over on the front, with 5 bays at the sides. You can just about make it out here. There's an artificial moat constructed here at the front of the house with a gateway on it. And the purpose of the moat was actually to stop the livestock from coming too close to the house. This would have featured at the time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Castle Otway and Kilby were both burnt in August 1922. And the only surviving feature from Castle Otway is actually, the gateway here at the artificial moat. That has been transferred across the road to we'll say, what was the rectory in Tipperery, and is now the entrance gate for the rectory there. So we'll say a small vestige of Castle Otway surviving. This is what the ruin actually looks like. You can see the original Tower House in the background, and the 5-bay front of Castle Otway. Again, showing the very steep pediment, which was typical of Leeson's work. So the original house here was known as Cloughonan Castle. The Otways, in tribute to themselves, renamed the area Castle Otway, and I suppose untypical in a way of a lot of the landowners at the time. But the Otway, as I mentioned, were one of the prime suppressors of the 1798 rebellion in Tipperary. But if you move on a little further, and by the 1800s, 1841, the parish priest in Tipperary is a man by the name of Father John Kenyon, very famous in, we'll say, terms of, politics at the time. Kenyon was from Limerick originally, studied for the priesthood in Rome, was ordained a priest, and was appointed parish priest in Tipperary. He would have been a confidant of John Martin, John Mitchell, and a lot of the young Irelanders of the time. And for a man, known to associate with undesirables or rebels, the Otway family actually bequeathed to John Kenyon a site for a house, and gave him the stone to construct a house in Tipperary. And if you look at if you go online to the Tipperary Studies website, you'll actually find an encumbered estates listing for Castle Otway. It came up in the encumbered estates in the 1850s, and the maps of the various lots, which list the tenants on the Otway estate and the annual rent that they're paying, they're all listed there on the Tipperary Studies website, along with, the maps and the acreage of each tenant. But the one person that stands out in that listing is Father John Kenyon. His title was freehold. He was the only freeholder on the Otway estate. and that was courtesy of Lady Otway at the time. She was instrumental in providing John Kenyon with the site for the house and the stone which to construct it. Now here you see Leeson Hall. Leeson Hall again was an actual Otway house. It would have been about, I suppose, about 5-6 miles from the original property at Castle Otway. It was built around 1750, and we know that, again from letters, that we know that Leeson Hall was was designed by William Leeson. That's in some of the some of the Waller letters. The Wallers and the Otways were related by marriage, and we know that Castle Otway was built by William Leeson. And from further correspondence, we know that that Leeson Hall was designed by the same architect that designed Castle Otway. So from that, we can deduce that the architect for Castle Otway was again William Leeson. So as I said, these houses, they weren't attributed to Leeson in any documentation other than, we'll say, these family letters. Now, unfortunately, Leeson Hall was destroyed, partially demolished, again due to the rate situation. The roof was removed in 1944, and one of the biggest architectural salvage auctions ever held in Tipperary was held in the grounds of Leeson Hall in 1944. The listing ran to almost 2 columns of the Nina Guardian at the time. Extensive, we'll say, listing of pitch pine floorboards, pitch pine beams, fireplaces. Like there were several Carrera marble fireplaces listed. There was slate fireplaces. You name it. Like it's an incredible list of stuff. The actual slates even, we'll say, they were cut in the form of jacks and queens, if you're familiar. We'll say alternative rows of slate with either a curved finish or a pointed finish on them. And these were given the names. We'll say the jacks were the pointed finish and the queens were the curved finish slates. But there was thousands upon thousands of lots of slate offered when Leeson Hall was demolished. Each and every, we'll say, the floorboards, the beams, the joists supporting the roof and the floors, the fireplaces, everything was literally stripped out and auctioned off. Say one of the largest auctions of architectural salvage ever held. Today, the ruin still stands, totally covered in ivy. You can hardly make out any feature of the house at all. It's just this massive, we'll say, tower of ivy standing in the middle of a field. Now we look at Leeson's additional works. We know that he designed Clonbrook House for the Burke family at Ahaskra in County Galway in 1785. Clonbrook would have been one of the finest houses in Galway, unfortunately destroyed by a fire in the 1940s. So again, another loss of Leeson's. Brook Lodge near Abbey-Knockmine in County Galway. Brook Lodge was an old house dating from the 1600s, but Leeson was engaged to redesign the house and we'll say totally renovated in the 1770s. He ended up actually turning the frontage of the house in a different direction, again constructing one of his characteristic ornamental lakes, and we'll say a total different layout of the house. And Palace House in Tina, County Galway, which was built in 1797 and survived up until the very late 1950s. In its latter years, it was a local convent, but again, sold in the late 1950s for the farmland really attached to it. And the house again was let just fall down and destroyed in the early 1970s. Now, additional work by Leeson. At the time Leeson was operating, the late 1700s, there was a movement in Ireland to bring back a lot of medieval monuments into use. And Leeson actually drew up plans for the restoration of Knockmy Abbey in County Galway. And in the National Library, we actually have these drawings by William Leeson, Delint William Leeson, and the year 1780. These are actually frescoes that were in Knockmy Abbey, located at Knockmy. And this is an O'Connor tomb in Knockmy. These are just two sketches of, I think, about 11 or 12 sketches existing in the National Library, done by William Leeson. They show, his interest in the medieval buildings, and he drew a complete plan for the reconstruction of the abbey. Now, in his final years, we know that he resided at New Grove House in County Galway. Again, unfortunately, New Grove has disappeared. A few tumble-down walls still exist on the site, but that's all the remains of the house. We know that he corresponded with the RDS regarding planting trees with a plough, which seems to have been quite an innovative procedure at the time. Up to then, seemingly, trees would have been planted individually. Leeson proposed turning the ground pretty much as forestry is constructed now, with a plough, turning the ground, sticking down the seedlings, and just knocking the soil back on top of them. And according to correspondence he had with the RDS, at the time he had over 400,000 seedlings of elm, oak, horse chestnut, sycamore, beech, etc. All native species of trees here in Ireland. And we say due to the correspondence he had with the RDS, we know that he actually received grants for planting of these trees and creating woodlands and stuff. We know that he died between September 1804, which is the last date we have for his correspondence with the RDS, and the year 1806, when probate of his will was taken out, March 1806. We've no record at all of the location of his burial, or whether he died in New Grove, and he's buried somewhere around Lochray. We don't know. We just know that the will was proven in 1806. We know that a daughter of his in 1803 married a Captain M. Kerwin, one of the Galway tribes, Kerwin tribes, and the only known descendant of William Leeson that still alive, a man by the name of Walter Kerwin. Some of you may have come across the name Walter Kerwin. He served as secretary in the Department of Antishuk at the time of the peace process, and he was chairman of the American Ireland Fund at one stage. He's featured extensively in a lot of the correspondence in relation to the peace process, letters with Martin Manzer, Albert Reynolds, Bertie Ahern. He's the last known descendant of William Leeson. Leeson made an important contribution to Irish architecture at the time. Those houses would have been constructed for pretty much the main landholders in both Tipperary and Galway at the time. I would say a lot of his fame came from the fact that the commission he was given by Brown for the design of Westport. Unfortunately, the destruction of the War of Independence and Civil War robbed us here in Tipperary of two of the, definitely the main building in Kilby, but probably one of a very important building in terms of Leeson's early work in the fact of losing Castle Ottaway. At the time Castle Ottaway was burnt, it was owned by Admiral John Ruthven Otway, and he decided not to rebuild Castle Otway. He took a lesser amount in compensation, and he moved to England. So we'll say the estate was sold off, broken up, given to handed over to the Land Commission, and broken into smaller lots which were distributed locally. Ireland in the mid-20th century, there was little regard for architectural heritage, particularly heritage associated with what we'd say the big house, which was seen as the domain of the invader, if you like. And I suppose a lot of it was a hangover from, we'll say, the struggle for independence and things like that. The people that were in power at the time, little or no regard for any of these buildings, and I would dare say the families that were desperately trying to hold on to them in a lot of instances, and trying to maintain what they saw as their heritage, and which is in fact part of all our heritage, really, because many of us would have had families that the only source of employment that they had was in these big houses, and in a lot of instances these families that worked in the big houses were well treated. And I mean, that was, we'll say, in the case of Kilboy, following the destruction of the house, 46 families were literally out on the side of the street. That was it, their employment was gone. They had no form of income. We'll say, following the destruction of Kilboy, Castle Otway would have been similar. Maybe not as extensive as 40s, in numbering into the 40s, but definitely it would have been the high 20s anyway, the numbers of families associated with Castle Otway. These people, when these houses were burnt, that was it. They just packed up and moved on somewhere else. We'll say for Prior Park, we can be thankful to Sally Waller. Sally hung on there, I would say, living literally in penury and misery, rather than part with that house, until she found someone that was going to take the house and, would say, not destroy it, that was going to purchase the property, not alone for the farmland, but for the house itself. And it was only then that she decided that the place was too much for her, that she could hand it over, knowing that the house was going to be kept on. And today the house has been fully restored. A man by the name of Bernard Bauer, he's an Austrian, he actually resides in the house for part of every year, comes over here for several months. More or less, it's his bolt hole where he comes to switch off, and spends a lot of time there. He's totally renovated the house from top to bottom, new roof on it, all new windows. The house is in absolutely pristine shape, thanks to Bauer, and it's the only extant work of William Leeson in County Tipperary, and pretty much countrywide. There are talks of reconstructing part of Clonbrook House, which would say is in extremely good condition as a room, and capable of being constructed. Whether it will happen remains to be seen, but Leeson's legacy has vanished other than Prior Park. You can see there some of the sources that are used in preparing the talk. And I'd just like to acknowledge Siobhan Harrington of Silvermines Historical Society, Jock Saunders, nephew of Sally Waller, Simon Wald, architect with Mayo County Council, and Emmeline Henderson of the Irish Georgian Society, who, when I originally prepared this talk, she was tremendous help to me. That concludes the talk. We'll move on now to any questions and answers session. If anyone has anything.